Look at that big old black bass right there. Golly. Today is all about the Swim Jig. That little guy right there, a fish catching machine from the basics all the way to some advanced tips. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. If you guys are looking for rods, reel, or your favorite swim jigs, Sportsman's Outfitters has some of the best prices around. So click those links down below in the description and you're greatly gonna help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Today is all about one of the deadliest techniques that there is in bass fishing, and that is the swim jig. Whether you fish ponds, whether you fish lakes, whether you fish rivers, this is one of the most effective tools that we have as bass fishermen to go out and catch bass. And one of the things that I love about a swim jig is that it isn't a, shut up, stupid bird. Hang on, hey. That bird was really starting to annoy me along with all these gnats. But guys, a swim jig works in a wide variety of water temperatures. I used to fish a pond in my backyard growing up, and the first bait that I could really catch fish on, and typically during the springtime, was a swim jig. As that water temperature started to creep up and those fish first started to move up, I found that a swim jig was really effective because in that colder water, it's just a subtle movement. And sometimes you don't want a ton of thump and vibration in that cold water. So it can work really, really well in colder water, but it also works well in the hottest water that you're gonna find. I mean, today the water temp's about 73, 74, but I've caught fish on swim jigs in the hottest water temperature like that I've fished, like upwards of 94 degrees on the James River. I've caught fish on a swim jig. So that's just one reason that you should become an expert at swim jigs. Another thing is a swim jig is, at the end of the day, it's a jig. You know, typical swim jigs, they typically have a vertical eye on them. They're a little bit more pointed, but at the end of the day, it's a jig. So you can do anything that you do with a normal jig with a swim jig. And I think that that's really important because some days you don't really know what the fish are doing, and to be able to just pick up one bait and go out there and fish it multiple different ways, you know, with the first being I can go out there and just swim it, I can swim it through cover, but if I see a good looking laydown or a brush pile, I can just flip that bad boy into that brush pile. Or if I kind of pull up on a rocky point and I want to drag this across the point, I can cast it out there and drag it across the point. So like I said, at the end of the day, a swim jig is just a jig. It's a very versatile lure. There we go, baby. Old swim jig bass. Now, with that being said, you can use pretty much any jig for a swim jig if you want. If you don't have a lot of budget, you know, you can pick up an Arky style jig head and that's gonna work. Now, this swim jig right here is actually probably my favorite swim jig right now. This is a Freedom Tackle swim jig. I'll actually link everything down below in the description if you guys want to actually pick up this exact stuff. A couple of reasons that I really like this swim jig is, one, it's a quality jig. It's got a very good hook in it, and that's one of the biggest things that I want in a swim jig is a good hook, because sometimes, like today, I'll fish a swim jig on braided line, and other days I'll fish it on fluorocarbon. And if you're fishing braided line and you're around big fish and you set the hook and you don't have a good hook, you will bend that hook out, and that's not what you want. So that's something that I really like about this little Freedom Tackle swim jig. The other thing that I really like is it has a good hook bite. If you look at the kind of head of this jig and then the top of the hook, that space in between the head and that hook is your bite on a jig. And you can see it has a good bite. Sometimes you'll have jigs where the jig head is actually almost parallel with the hook itself, and that can cause you to miss fish when they come up there and grab it, because the jig head itself will actually almost act like a weed guard, preventing you from hooking up with that fish. Now, the last thing that I really like about this little swim jig is it has these little red eyes on it. And I do believe that sometimes bass will get keyed on to seeing eyeballs. From time to time, I've seen it in swim baits where having a jig head that has eyes can make a big difference. So I don't know that it always makes a difference with a swim jig, a lot of times because you're fishing it pretty fast, but the fact that it does have eyes, I mean, I like that. And the best thing about this jig is it's pretty inexpensive. Now, when it comes to a trailer of a swim jig, I really like to keep it simple because jig trailers can get uber complex at times, but when you are primarily swimming a jig, this is the crawl that I probably use 95% of the time. I mean, almost all the time, and that is a Strike King Rage Crawl. And the reason that I like the Strike King Rage Crawl is that it doesn't have a ton of drag in the water. Although it does have kick and it puts off some vibration, it doesn't have a ton of drag. I can really control how deep that bait is getting and how fast that I'm bringing that bait. And because I have more control of that bait, I really feel like I catch more fish because of that. Now, every now and then I will use like a Berkley Chigger Crawl or even a swim bait trailer. A lot of times I use a swim bait trailer when I'm fishing kind of offshore grass lines and things like that. But I mean, like I said, 95% of the time, if I'm fishing shallow around cover, that Strike King Rage Crawl is hard to beat. Another thing that I keep extremely simple is colors. You know, today I'm fishing a black and blue. The reason I'm fishing black and blue is this water, although it doesn't look like it, it's actually a little bit muddier. And so I like a black and blue in a little bit muddier water, or if I'm having really dark conditions. If I went out here and I was fishing clear water, but it was really cloudy out, I'm gonna pick up that black and blue. Now, another swim jig I fish a lot is just your standard green pumpkin. A green pumpkin is perfect at mimicking a bluegill, which is something that we mimic a lot when we are fishing a swim jig. Now, the other color that I use a lot is white, just straight up white, some sort of shad pattern swim jig. If I'm fishing around fish that I think are eating shad, I'm gonna go with that white swim jig. It's really, really simple. Now, I have picked up a pink swim jig from time to time, and I've actually caught them pretty decent on a pink swim jig. The reason that I even picked it up is because I know that bass love a floating pink worm, and so I just wanted to do an experiment one day with it, and I actually caught a bunch of bass on this little pink swim jig. But for the most part, green pumpkin, black and blue, and white. Now, when it comes to where I like to fish a swim jig, a lot of times it's pretty shallow water. And if you think about it, a lot of places that you're gonna throw a spinnerbait or a chatterbait is a great place to throw the swim jig. Now, the best thing about a swim jig versus a spinnerbait or a chatterbait is it will work in a little bit more slick conditions. A lot of times when you fish that chatterbait or you fish that spinnerbait, you might want to have a little bit of a chop on the water or maybe some cloudy conditions. A lot of times in order to get bit on those baits, you really need a little bit less light penetration. But with a swim jig, you know, if you look at it today, I mean, it's pretty calm out, you know, and I'm able to still catch some fish on the swim jig. I'm kind of causing a reaction strike, swimming it really close to this cover. And that's where the swim jig is going to have a bigger advantage over something like a spinnerbait or a chatterbait. Now, as far as my equipment goes with a swim jig, I like a 7-foot to 7-foot 3-inch rod, usually a medium heavy power and a fast action. This particular rod here is an arc rod. It's the Tharp series rod, and it's their money maker rod. This is literally my favorite rod of all time. I typically like a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. This is the Bruin ELS reel, and again, I'm typically using 50-pound braid, sometimes 15 or 20-pound fluorocarbon if I'm fishing it in clear water situations. Now, let's jump up on the front deck of the boat real quick and show you exactly how to fish this. So one of the best things about a swim jig is that there's really no bad way to fish it. When I first actually started catching fish on a swim jig, I was literally just reeling the bait, like this. And I started catching fish on it in my pond, literally just casting it out and reeling it in. And every now and then I would kind of just twitch the rod tip. Now, a lot of times that's actually still how I kind of work it, but I tend to put a lot more twitches and drops into it than I used to. So my typical cast, I'm gonna cast that bait out, I'm gonna get it swimming, and I'm gonna pop the rod, drop it, pop the rod, and drop it, just like that, okay? That's really it. Like I said, I like to keep it pretty simple on a cast. I'm usually keeping that rod tip high, and I'm just kind of popping that bait up and dropping it. There are gonna be days when you're fishing that swim jig where it seems like the fish will be attracted to it because it's swimming, but as soon as you kind of pop it and let it fall for a split second, bam, that's when they get it. Now, a way a lot of guys fish it, like in Alabama, is what they call the Alabama shake, where you're literally going to be shaking your rod tip like this the entire time, where you're just constantly shaking your rod just like that. Whenever you're doing that, it really makes that jig skirt flare. And sometimes when it flares like that will be the reason that bass are eating it. So that's the Alabama shake. A lot of the time I fish a 3/8 ounce in a swim jig a lot. Sometimes if I want that bait to go slower and really high in the water column, I'll go up to 1/4. If I want it to go really fast in the water column, I might throw a 1/2 ounce, but most of the time it's a 3/8 ounce. Oh man, all about the same size, all about 3-pounders today. Before I let you go, I want to tell you about 2 little keys that really help me to catch more fish on a swim jig. And the first one is that there are days when you fish a swim jig that the fish are going to want this right below the surface. And I'm talking like literally a 1/2 inch. You like almost don't want to break the water, but you want to be as close as you can to not breaking the surface of the water. Literally, you're creating a V that whole time. And I don't know what it is. I have seen it though multiple times that you won't get bit on a swim jig, even if it's a 1/2 foot down or 1 foot down. But if you bring it just below the surface, and I'm talking just below the surface, again, where you're making that little V wake, for some reason, on some days, bass are only going to bite it that way. So always keep that in your mind, because I've been in the boats before with people that are fishing a swim jig too low, and if they just bring it up a little bit higher, they're going to start getting a lot more bites. Now, the next thing that's going to help you get a lot more bites with the swim jig is actually start pitching a swim jig more than you cast the swim jig. And I actually made another video all about swim jigs. I'm gonna link it right here. And in that video, I talk about why pitching a swim jig instead of casting it is so much more effective and how you can catch a lot more bass because of it. So comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.